Welcome, everyone, to, yes, Burrito Lunch at UC Center Sacramento, but also our Wednesday speaker series. My name is Catherine Baker, and for probably most of you in this room, I'm a brand new face. I'm a freshman this week, and probably for the next year, because I'm the new director of the Student and Policy Center here. And thank you very much. I am grateful to follow in the shoes in a terrific foundation that our own Dr. Richard Kravitz, who is in the back, who usually gives this introduction, he set a wonderful foundation in developing a robust speaker series, and he had the inspiration to have this program today. So we want to thank Dr. Kravitz for that, because boy, was that a timely topic. So let's give him a hand. Thank you very much for welcoming him and his heritage here. Today's program is something that, as I say, couldn't have possibly been a more timely subject, and one that I'm completely geeking out about as a political science major myself in background. And so I'd like to introduce to you our speaker and also make sure you have in mind some terrific questions, because we have such a wonderful resource here today. Professor Eric Engstrom is a professor at UC Davis. Go Aggies. I know there's a few of you in the room here. He's a professor of political science who specializes in the study of the United States Congress, political parties, and the development of the American political system. So if you're a poli-sci person, or even if you just care about our elections and our democracy, you are got a terrific speaker today. Originally, well, he's taught for over 20 years. Originally at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and then since 2008 at UC Davis. And he was also chair of the department from 2017 to 2021, very distinguished professor. And as I was looking at some of the publications that he's had, first of all, I want to take your classes, so I hope I can sign up for that. But some of the publications include, for example, I mean, it's a terrific list. There's 4 books. The Politics of Ballot Design, How the American States Shaped Democracy. And this was just recently, but in the last few years, not just after the 2000 elections. I mean, so timely for what we've seen changes in that evolution as well. Also, Race, Class, and Social Welfare, American Populism Since the End of the New Deal. And Party Ballots Reform and the Transformation of America's Electoral System. One of the 3 of the 4 books that he's published, including Partisan Gerrymandering and the Construction of American Democracy. So good, hearty material for those of you who care about our government. But I also looked at some of the other articles that he's done that I'm going to have on my reading list now. And I'm just going to give you the topics real quick. Democracy in America, What Has Gone Wrong and What Can We Do About It? That title alone sounds like something that we'd all should study. And Do Moderate Voters Weigh Candidates' Ideology? These moderate voters, are they independent voters or otherwise? The Rise and Decline of Turnout in Congressional Elections, and also Congressional Earmarks. You've studied that and written on that as well. And Candidate Quality, the Personal Vote and Incumbency Advantage in Congress. So he's got a distinguished career studying, writing, and teaching in topics that are very relevant to our lives and what happens in our government and country. And today, you're going to hear about what happens if a presidential candidate becomes unable to stand for election or assume office. With that, a warm welcome to Professor Engstrom. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and congratulations on your new position here at the UC Center. As I was telling the students earlier, this is just a fabulous resource for the UCs and for students. And so I'm happy to talk to you today about what might happen if a presidential candidate becomes unable to stand for election or assume office. And I was asked about 4 or 5 months ago by Dr. Kravitz to come talk on this topic, and my original response was, that sounds like it's going to be pretty dry, a boring talk about the 20th Amendment, which no one even knows what's in the 20th Amendment, or the 1947 Presidential Succession Act. That sounds pretty dry and irrelevant, but Richard was prescient that these are discussions that are on the front page of the New York Times as we speak. I checked the New York Times just a few minutes ago, and the lead story was, well, what might happen if Biden were to withdraw? And so obviously the discussion surrounding, in the wake of the debate, performance by President Biden has heightened some of these issues. I'm going to talk more generally about what might happen if a presidential candidate has to withdraw either voluntarily or involuntarily. But the large, and so I will talk a little bit about the kind of pressing concerns about President Biden and what the Democrats might or might not do. But the larger talk is intended to address the more general issue of what happens if a candidate withdraws or dies before inauguration. Just to preface this, looking at this question is obviously a bit morbid and not something that any of us should want to happen to any candidate, but I hope it's useful to have some understanding of the potential contingencies that might arise in any presidential election, whether it be this current one or other elections in the future. And one reason why I think this question is interesting from an academic standpoint is there's not much historical precedent for what would happen. So we don't have a lot of precedent historically or even kind of legally worked out in terms of what might happen. We'll learn that there are guidelines and procedures in place, but there's also some ambiguities present. And so I'll talk about some of those ambiguities. So as I said, there's no kind of real historical precedent, certainly in the modern period of the presidency, which we in scholarship typically date to kind of modern presidential elections, talk about kind of after 1968 or so. So there's certainly no kind of recent historical precedent, and very little historical precedent if we go even back further into the timeline of presidential history. But let me start by saying that the concerns about illness, potential presidents dying before the end of their term is something that we do have some experience with, at least post-election. So I want to start with just some brief numbers and historical background. So 45 people have served as president. There's 46 presidencies, but we count Cleveland twice there. So 45 people have served as president. 8 of those presidents have died in office. I have the list of names there. 4 were assassinated. Those are the names in bold. So that's about 17% of our presidents haven't made it all the way through to the end of their terms. Also, just as a side note, 7 vice presidents have died in office. So that's also something that's happened. And I can talk more about vice presidents later if you would like. That's going to add a whole another layer of complications to this. But I'm going to kind of skirt the vice presidency here for most of the talk. So 8 have died in office. There have also been a number of presidents who have fallen seriously ill while in office. This is not a comprehensive list, but just some examples. James Garfield was incapacitated for 2 months after he was shot. He eventually perished, and so he's on that previous list as well. But there were 2 months where we had a president who was essentially out of commission. Woodrow Wilson suffered a major stroke in 1919, and this may have a little relevance for contemporary elections. He made hints and inclinations that he wanted to be renominated in 1920. The Democratic leaders in 1920 said no and chose not to renominate him due to concerns about his health. So there's Franklin Roosevelt suffered from coronary disease in the run-up to the 1944 election, and as we know, died a year later. And in fact, concerns about his health prompted leaders of the Democratic Party to replace the current Vice President, Henry Wallace, who they felt wasn't up to the task of taking over the presidency in the middle of World War II, and replaced him with Harry Truman at the 1944 convention. And this was to some extent due to concerns about Franklin Roosevelt's health and whether he would survive the next 4 years, which, as we know, he did not. And then another example, Dwight Eisenhower suffered a major heart attack while president in 1955. Eisenhower was a chain smoker. He had defeated the Nazis during World War II, so just a little bit of stress in his life. So probably not a surprise that he suffered a major heart attack when you combine that with smoking. But he did rebound and run and win in 1956. And then finally, Ronald Reagan was incapacitated after being shot in 1981 in an assassination attempt, and depending on various historical accounts, bounced back either in the spring, but others say he didn't really bounce back until October, and he'd been shot in early of 1981. So a number of months in which the president was recuperating from a serious health issue. So those are some examples. They're not exhaustive of the illness that's befallen presidents while in office. There have also been some close calls. I'll just give you a few examples of that. Andrew Jackson survived an assassination attempt in 1835. John Tyler, who was the president who had taken over from the deceased president, William Henry Harrison. John Tyler survived a ship explosion in 1844. And just as a side note, the vice presidency was vacant at the time. It's not exactly clear what would have happened if Tyler had died. There wasn't kind of clear guidelines at that point. So that was a close call. This is not really the presidency, but I always find it an interesting historical detail. The vice president in 1865, Andrew Johnson, was also one of the targets in the plot to kill Lincoln. So here's another case where we may have had both the president and the vice presidency vacant, but that plot fizzled out before it got to Johnson. And then another one, and this is just interesting to those of us in California, since we're right next to the Capitol. Gerald Ford was actually the target of an assassination attempt in Sacramento while speaking on the Capitol steps in 1975. And the would-be assassin was Lynette Squeaky Frome, a member of the Manson family. And so I don't think any bullets were actually fired, but she had pulled a gun out and threatened Ford. So those are close calls. So this is all to say that injury, illness, near misses, and death have hit the presidency at a number of moments in our history. However, we've never really faced a situation in the modern era in which a major party nominee or president-elect has fallen seriously ill or died. And so there's little historical precedent or example for this scenario. So what might happen during a presidential election if a candidate withdraws or dies? And when I first agreed to this talk, I thought, well, that's probably going to be a pretty simple answer. The vice president takes over. It's more complicated than that, especially if you think about the Republicans right now. They don't have a vice presidential nominee, so who would take over in that scenario? So it's not as straightforward as one would think. And what happens depends critically on when it happens. And so one of the things that I'm going to have to walk through today is the timeline of presidential elections. So what happens depends on when it happens. And there are a number of different contingencies in the process and in this timeline where the rules will start changing over time. The entity that makes a decision starts changing over time. And what the potential outcomes will start changing over time. And it really depends on where we are. And when we get into the electoral college part of this, we'll see that it can start pretty quickly to get into the real weeds. So I'm going to try and keep this kind of unweedy as possible, but there will be some parts where we're going to have to dig into some details here. The reason for all of these, this variation is because of the particular way that we elect presidents in the United States. We have a long multi-stage process of selecting presidents, which creates a variety of potential contingencies. And in reflecting on the comparisons to other countries, those of us who were watching the British elections last week might have noted they had a 4-week campaign. They had an election night. Literally the next morning, Keir Starmer was inside 10 Downing Street measuring the drapes. That's not how it is in the United States. We have, as you know, we have this year-long process, at least a year-long process, with a number of different stages involved in that. And so the question of what happens if a candidate withdraws or dies depends on where we are in that process. And it's a result of a complex mix of national and state party rules. So another thing that, if you don't know, but will kind of become relevant as we go through this, is another difference between the United States and many other countries is we have a highly decentralized, federalized election system. So we really have 50 separate electoral systems, and in the Electoral College you can add DC into that, so 51 separate electoral systems. Each party has its own national rules. Each state party has its own rules. There are constitutional provisions which enter into the picture, particularly after the nomination phase. There are federal laws layered on top of this, and then state laws that are layered on top of this. So once I started digging into this, I realized this is much more involved than one might think. And so when you put all of this together, what happens, it really is going to depend on where we are, and that will decide which of this stew of rules, whether it's party rules or constitutional rules or federal or state laws, come into play. It depends on where we are in the process. And that will then also shape the behavior of would-be successor candidates or the parties and what they do in this process. So to understand what might happen, I want to first outline the presidential selection timeline. And so I apologize in advance if this is too basic. This is stuff that hopefully, if you've taken any of my classes, a few of you have been in my classes, we go over. But I think it's important to kind of lay out the critical steps here in the presidential election process. And when I show this to students, I often challenge them to come up with a more complex method for selecting a chief executive around the world, and no one has come up with one yet. So maybe there is one out there. I'm not a master of all election systems around the world, but ours is incredibly complex and long. Again, the UK had an election in 4 weeks. Ours is going to take, we still have 4 months to go in ours. Okay, so here's the timeline. And I'm going to hit the kind of critical pieces of the timeline that are relevant for this question of what happens if someone withdraws. So the first step, which is the step that we're in right now in 2024, is the nomination phase. This involves state-level primaries and caucuses, depending on the particular state. Some states use primaries, some use caucuses, almost many use primaries nowadays. And that's, as we know, a state-by-state process. We don't have a single-day primary or caucus election date in the United States. So this is a process that's going on from January or December, depending on the particular year, up through about June. And so I'll come back to that in a minute of what that might mean if a candidate were to die or withdraw sometime before that process. And then this, let me also say, and I'll talk more about this in a second, one thing to remember, and this is critical for we're going to talk about going forward, and also critical for thinking about what might happen if Biden or Trump, for example, were to withdraw, is that this process is the selection of delegates. Right? So this is a delegate selection process. So you're voting in a primary, you're registering a preference for a candidate, but what you're really going to end up with are delegates, or individuals pledged to a particular candidate. And they will assemble at the National Convention. And the National Conventions then are formally the place where the nominees are decided upon. Right, so the conventions are the decision-making body. So I won't go into the detail. There's a complex, fascinating history about the way that parties have nominated presidential nominees. It's varied considerably over time, but under the current set of rules, the primaries and caucuses, voters register their preferences. Those preferences get translated into delegates, and those delegates go to the conventions. And the conventions then are where the decisions are made. The Republicans are holding their convention next week, July 15th through the 18th, which means we probably should hear about the VP nominee pretty soon. We talked about that with the students upstairs. And then the Democrats will be holding their convention August 19th through the 22nd. And I put an asterisk there because if you don't know, currently the Democrats have scheduled a virtual roll call vote for August 7th. So for a variety of complex reasons that we don't need to get into, they move the date at which they're going to vote on the nominee to August 7th, well in advance of the convention. Now they may change their mind and move it back to the convention, but unless someone knows different, my understanding is that right now it's scheduled for August 7th, where the delegates would have a virtual roll call vote. I don't know if that's over Zoom or whatever, which is something they did in 2020 during the COVID pandemic. So if you start thinking about what might happen if Biden withdraws or not, this is the convention, but August 7th right now is when that roll call is, and that's the critical nomination vote for a candidate. Okay, so that's primaries, caucuses. Then we have the general election, which runs through September and November. We'll see that there are different rules for what happens if a candidate has to drop out for whatever reason there. And then election day this year will be November 6th. I put the tilde there to indicate in contemporary presidential elections, election day really begins earlier than the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, because we have many states like California which have mail-in voting, early voting, etc. And so election day really starts a few weeks earlier. And so again, if you start thinking about what might happen if a candidate withdraws, ballots are going to go out in the mail, especially in states with large mail-in populations like California, Oregon, Colorado, etc. Those ballots have to be printed pretty early in the process. So that's another kind of caveat to put in there. Okay, now, so that's up through election day. Then we get into everyone's favorite high school AP government topic, the Electoral College. And this is also part of why our system is so complex. But I want to just walk through some of the key dates and features here, because these raise different contingencies for what might happen if a candidate has to step down or passes away. Again, as a reminder, much like when we vote in primaries and caucuses, we're choosing delegates. When we vote in a general election, hopefully we all know, you're not voting for a Biden or Trump per se. You're voting for these people called electors, and these electors are pledged to vote on your behalf for the candidate that you registered your preference for. And we'll talk in a little more detail about that. But under the Constitution, the decision-making body for the selection of a president is the Electoral College. These are these electors which are selected in each state. Each state sets its own rules for selecting its electors, and not each, but in some states, the individual state parties have their own rules for selecting who the actual individuals will be. I can talk about that. California has a unique way that we choose the actual individuals who serve in the Electoral College. And I can come back to that. But the key thing for us right now is just to note that so we're selecting these electors, and the actual meeting and vote for the presidency happens, this year it's going to happen on December 16th. And so the electors meet in all of the state capitals, the 50 state capitals, and then in DC. And so that's where they formally select who the president's going to be. So we have this meeting in December 16th. Those electoral votes then are forwarded on to Congress. And those electoral votes are opened in Congress. This used to be kind of a minor detail that students would kind of, what is that even about? And in fact, I was teaching a class literally during January 6th, and students were like, hey, wait a minute, something's going on. I guess they weren't paying attention to me, they were watching the news on their phone. So anyway, so electoral votes are opened in Congress on January 6th. And we'll see that there are different contingencies that might arise in between these dates. And then the inauguration takes place on January 20th. So we have this long timeline, some of it driven by the primary process, and then the Electoral College process, which lays out these different steps. And so to understand what's going to happen at any one of these, or in the whole process, we need to understand what happens at any one of these steps. And there are different things that could happen at each step. So that's why I'm highlighting these differences. And so I'm going to walk through each of these in turn. So, and the first one is the one that might be most interesting to you at the moment, because this is the phase that we're in right now. So this is before and during the national conventions. And so as I already said, primaries and caucuses, this is a delegate selection process. So, and it's already concluded in terms of the selection of delegates in 2024. The delegates on both sides have been chosen, I think, for the most part. So the next stage is the national conventions, as I said, where they formally select the presidential. And I should also point out, the conventions are where you're formally selecting the vice presidential nominee. So the primaries and caucuses phase, we aren't voting on who the vice presidential nominee should be. That formal decision still resides with the conventions. Now, in practice, we know that the presidential candidate picks the person they want, and then the conventions just ratify ratify that person. But formally, that still kind of resides with the convention. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. And then I mentioned that the Democrats scheduling their virtual nomination roll call vote for August 2nd, or August 7th, excuse me. So, okay, so here's the Democratic nomination rules. So this is the part kind of where we're in the thick of this right now in 2024. So, as we're selecting delegates under the rules of the Democratic Party, the vast majority of those delegates are what they call pledged delegates. So under the Democratic Party rules, they're pledged delegates. So they're delegates that are pledged to support the candidate that was the preference back in their state. Currently, it's like 84.9% of the delegates of all the delegates are pledged to Joe Biden on the Democratic side. There's a few Dean Phillips delegates and a few uncommitted, but the vast majority are pledged to Joe Biden. And there's no kind of legal formal rule that says you like a robot, you must vote for Joe Biden or whoever the candidate you're pledged to is. The Democratic rules say in all good conscience. Right, so that's the term they use. In all good conscience, you're supposed to support the candidate that you said you would support as a delegate. Also, the presidential campaigns are very involved in the selection of these delegates, right? So the delegates that are going to be going to the convention on the Democratic side, for example, are Biden delegates. They've been selected on behalf of the Biden campaign to represent them at the convention. So just think about that as we move forward. There are, I won't go into great detail here, a smaller number of what the Democrats call automatic delegates. You may have heard the phrase superdelegates. These are delegates that are not formally pledged to any candidate. And automatic delegates, these superdelegates in the Democratic Party are supposed to be kind of the party bigwigs. So all of the Democratic members of the House, U.S. House, all the Democratic senators, Democratic governors, and other kind of party elites make up these superdelegates. Under the current rules, their vote cannot determine the outcome on the first ballot at a convention. So what this means is that for all intents and purposes, these pledged delegates are deciding the outcome at the conventions, and that's, I don't want to go into the kind of historical battles that have played out over this issue, but the Democrats really put primacy on these pledged delegates making the decisions. And so as a result, due to the preponderance of pledged delegates, modern conventions, and by that scholars usually date this to before the 1968 National Convention and after the 1968 National Convention, modern conventions are what scholars call basically coronations, rubber stamping, decisions that have been made already. Right? So by the time you get to the convention, there's no kind of real dispute about who the nominee will be. And there hasn't been a multi-ballot convention on the Democratic side since 1952. So, 70 years in which they have a ballot, the nominee's chosen, and we move on. So there's that. And so this will, I'm laying this out because this will influence our discussion about what might happen if a candidate withdraws. So if a candidate withdraws or dies before the convention, their delegates become free agents. And so there's no kind of real precedent for that in the post-1968 world. I should say before 1968, when the delegates went to the convention, most of them were free agents, right? And so the conventions were real decision-making bodies, but for reasons we don't need to get into, that changed after 1968. So right now, if a candidate died before the convention, their delegates would become free agents, meaning they could vote for a candidate of their choice. Similarly, under the democratic rules, if a candidate withdraws in writing, I should say they withdraw, and then they have to, the rules say, in writing, say that they're freeing their delegates. Right, so all the delegates that are pledged to me are now free to vote for a nominee of their choosing. All right, so this would free the pledged delegates. And so here's just some possible scenarios. And I put Biden here. You could put Trump. Not likely that Trump's going to withdraw by next week, but I don't want to kind of single out Biden, but this is the discussion that's going on in the news. So some possible scenarios if Biden were to withdraw. So if he were to withdraw, for example, and release his delegates, free them in writing. One possibility would be that it could be a return to these old-style conventions that we had in the 19th and early 20th century, in which decisions were made by the delegates at the convention. So that's a possibility, but that would be kind of building a process on the fly. So, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when the conventions were actually making decisions, there was, an informal apparatus, party bosses and party machines that kind of engineered and coordinated this process. This would be a more open style process if this were to happen. So if Biden were to withdraw and free his delegates. I think a more likely scenario, if Biden were to withdraw, would be to withdraw and then ask his delegates to support a specified individual. Now, those delegates wouldn't be obligated to do that, but for the sake of coordination, which parties are always worried about, one would imagine that seems to me a potential scenario if Biden were to withdraw. And I think the obvious endorsee would be Kamala Harris there as vice president. And one thing I'm not great on the details, but just worth mentioning here is there's also, you read the news stories about this, there's also the issue of where does all the campaign finance money go? My understanding right now is that this is the Biden-Harris campaign, and so Kamala Harris could more easily step in and take over the money that's been raised. They've raised a lot of money for a presidential campaign. There's a huge campaign staff that's been built up in preparation for this election. And so I'm not making any predictions here, but it just seems like the path, if Biden were to withdraw, would be a little easier to follow this one here. And then there's also been some discussion, which I'll just briefly mention, about opening up the convention. And that would be hard to do, I think, because the rules of these pledged delegates, I think the Democrats would have to alter their rules in some fashion. And one thing to remember about conventions is that they're parliamentary bodies. They set their own rules. And so I think it would be a challenge to change the rules now to kind of unpledge the delegates. But it doesn't say it couldn't happen, but I think that scenario seems less likely. Okay, I spend a lot of time on that because that's kind of what we're most concerned about. But let me run through some of the other scenarios here. I'll just briefly say about the Republican side, they're largely the same. They use different terminology. Their delegates are bound delegates, and a candidate can become unbound if delegates can become unbound if a candidate withdraws or is deceased. And I'll skip over this. Okay, so next, the contingency is what happens between the conventions and election day. There's no law that covers this contingency, so if a candidate dies after they've been made the nominee, but before election day, there's no law that covers this. But each national party has adopted rules governing the selection of a new nominee in the event of death, resignation, or disability of a nominee. I won't bore you with the details there, but the short version is the DNC or the RNC would choose a new nominee. So instead of regathering all the delegates, the DNC or the RNC, they have rules in place. They'll select a new nominee. The most likely scenario, obviously, would be the elevation of the vice presidential nominee. They've been chosen to succeed the president in case a president dies. So it seems like the logic would apply there in the case of a presidential candidate passing away. But there is one lingering question, which I'm not entirely sure of the answer of, is what happens with those rules now that we have early voting and the deadlines to print ballots. For example, mail balloting and early voting sites in California start October 7th. So this is one area where there's some ambiguity. I assume the parties would kind of figure this out if they have to. Okay, I want to get through the others. So there is no real historical precedent for this in terms of presidential candidates. There have been 2 vice presidential candidates who have died during the campaign. They were, let me take that back. One died, James Sherman. I'm not going to go into detail on this. And he was quickly replaced in the RNC. And then in 1972, the Democratic vice presidential nominee, Thomas Eagleton, resigned, and then weeks after the convention, the DNC assembled and selected a new VP nominee. So there's some precedent for this on the vice presidential side. So, okay, so that's the big takeaway there is that up until the convention, up until election day, it's largely party business. Parties are in charge of selecting their nominees and then selecting replacements. Now we get into election day and after. Now constitutional provisions, federal laws and state laws become operative, and the key law that I've bolded here, or key constitutional provision, is that well-known amendment that everyone knows about, the 20th Amendment. I was going to do a poll to see if anyone's even heard of the 20th Amendment. It's a boring amendment dealing with when the inauguration takes place, when Congress meets. But they also, Section 3 of that included a provision of, well, what happens if a president-elect dies? And here's the critical sentence here. If at the time fixed for the beginning of the term of the president-elect shall have died, the vice president-elect shall become president. So the president-elect passes away according to the 20th Amendment, then the vice president-elect shall become president. Seems straightforward, right? Well, when do you become president-elect? Election day, November, when the electors vote in the state capitals, when Congress opens and counts the electoral votes. There's some ambiguity there, right? Certainly this seems true, but what about these others, right? And so I'm not a constitutional scholar, but there's some debate about that. When exactly does the magic moment does a person become president-elect? And so we need to walk through these other steps of the Electoral College to talk about what might happen. Okay, so, and there will be a number of contingencies here. So the next one is between Election Day, November 6th, and the day the electors vote, December 15th. So you basically have a month and a half there. So if a candidate dies in this period, remember we're selecting electors. Electors theoretically would be free to vote how they please, right? They could vote how they please, theoretically. But the likely scenario, I think, is that the national party committees would coordinate and instruct their electors on who to vote for, right? And again, it seems like the likely scenario would be for the national parties to step in and tell the electors, vote for the vice presidential nominee, elevate them, and then we'll work out the vice presidency at some later point, if not at that point. So I think that's the likely scenario. But again, the electors are free there. One potential caveat, again, there's some ambiguity, and there's Supreme Court case about this, but one potential caveat might be that there are some statutes in some states mandating electors comply with their pledges, so that when they become an elector, I'm pledged to vote for Donald Trump, or I'm pledged to vote for Joe Biden. Could they be free from that pledge if their candidate dies? In California, there's actually a statute that says, yeah, you're free to vote for someone else if this person dies. But that's not true in every state, and so there's some ambiguity there. Okay, so has anyone died in this period? One time. That was Horace Greeley, who was running against Ulysses Grant in 1872. He's the only major party nominee to die after voting before the Electoral College had met, and then his electoral votes scattered to other individuals. It didn't affect the electoral outcome because Grant handily defeated Horace Greeley in that election. So we only have one example of this, and it's not really setting much precedent. So that's between election day and the day electors meet. Okay, so now we have this next period of between the day electors vote and the day Congress counts electoral votes. This is perhaps the most confusing period, but I'll tell you what my best understanding is. So this says that, again, the 20th Amendment, or the 20th Amendment says that the vice president becomes president if the president-elect dies. So the question is someone a president-elect when the electors have met? If so, then it seems like the 20th Amendment clearly kicks in. Or is someone president-elect only when Congress meets and opens those electoral votes on January 6th? And so there's some ambiguity there. It seems like common sense and pragmatism would suggest that if the electors have met, that person that has become the president-elect, right? Whoever's received the majority of those electoral votes. Again, I think the likely scenario is that Congress would count the electoral votes of the deceased candidate on January 6th, and then the 20th Amendment would kick in, making the vice president the president. That seems like common sense. One might expect legal challenges around that because we don't really have any legal precedent on that. Okay, has that ever happened? No, but there was a close call. So during that period, Franklin Pierce survived a horrific train derailment on January 6th. It's just terrible. I won't even go into details there. But he survived, and the inauguration in those days wasn't until March. So we didn't have to really face this scenario, but it was a close call. And now the final step between the day Congress counts electoral votes, January 6th, and the inauguration on January 20th. Here, I think it's clear that the 20th Amendment is clearly operative. If the president-elect dies, the vice president becomes president on Inauguration Day, and then after the inauguration, the new president would select a vice president via the 25th Amendment. You can go into the details on that if you would like. So that one, there's I don't think any ambiguity on that. The 20th Amendment clearly covers that contingency. Has this ever happened? No, but there was a close call. This is kind of lost to the mists of time, but it almost happened to Franklin Roosevelt. And so Franklin Roosevelt survived an assassination attempt in Miami in February of 1933. So again, the inauguration wasn't until March. He was standing on a dais, or sitting on a dais, so however the case may be, in Miami, and he was standing next to the mayor of Chicago, Anton Cermak, and the mayor of Chicago was shot and died there. Roosevelt wasn't harmed, but that was a close call. So that's the only kind of historical precedent with that. Okay, so let me summarize very briefly here these various contingencies. So again, up through the convention, the delegates would ultimately decide at the convention. After the convention through election day, the DNC and the RNC each have procedures for replacing a candidate. As I said, early voting and mail-in balloting complicate this. Once ballots go out, you can't reprint someone's name, so that would complicate that replacement process. Next, November 6th through the Electoral College meeting in mid-December, electors would decide. I'm positing that the most likely scenario is they would be instructed by the DNC or the RNC on how best to vote. Between the Electoral College meeting in mid-December and January 6th, presumably Congress would count the electoral votes as is and then let the 20th Amendment process kick in, but that's not a guarantee, but that seems likely to me. And then after January 6th through the inauguration, the 20th Amendment clearly applies here. I'm just about out of time. There is another contingency. What happens if no one qualifies by January 20th? Like, wait, what? There is a contingency that could happen. Imagine there's a tie in the Electoral College, 269 to 269. No one's received a majority. Then the U.S. House has to decide who the president's going to be. Yeah, I see the hands. Oh my God, I'm adding to your anxiety. The Senate decides who the vice president is. And imagine they can't decide, right? So then the Presidential Succession Act kicks in. So welcome, President, Speaker Mike Rogers. Oh, okay. So on that note, I'll conclude and turn it over for questions.
All right, thank you, Dr. Engstrom, for that fantastic talk today. So we are going to go ahead and move into the Q&A portion. We do have folks who are on Zoom as well as in person, so we'll go ahead and kind of flip-flop to both sides. So we're going to do in person first. If you can go ahead and say your name and then affiliation as well as the question, that would be great. And then we'll go to our Zoom audience next. And for Zoom audience members, if you can also put down your name and affiliation as well at the time when you'll ask the question, just so I can go ahead and announce that as well.
Hi, my name is Lena Sisu. I'm a student at UCLA. And I was wondering what you think the chances of Biden stepping down of his own volition is. And if he does, do you think that would help or hurt the Democrats' cause?
Yeah, those are the $64,000 questions. I mean, I don't know the answer to the first one, other than all the rhetoric from the Biden himself and from the Biden campaign has been he's staying in the race, and so right now I think we have to take him at his word. There's no, as I was trying to say, no real way to open up the convention without him voluntarily doing so. So I can't make a prediction there, but I think the scenario that would have to happen, it sounds like, is if enough of the Democratic leadership said we want to go a different direction, then potentially that might happen. But yeah, I don't have a great odds. The students earlier were asking about that as well. I know that's the big question everyone wants to know, and I don't know at the moment. I'm sorry to punt on that a little bit. And then in terms of helping, this was another question the students were asking in our student session earlier. Maybe on the margins. I mean, our electorate, one thing to know about our electorate, what you probably all know, is that it's a highly partisan electorate. There's not a lot of movement amongst the swing voters. There aren't many swing voters anymore. And so replacing one Democrat with another might matter on the margin in the swing states of the Electoral College, which is where it's really going to matter. But in terms of kind of large-scale swings of the vote, I don't think a different nominee is going to make a huge difference. But again, it might matter on the margins, and this election is going to be fought on the margins, and won and lost on the margins. So.
Great, thank you. So we do have several questions on Zoom. And I'm going to combine kind of two questions here. So one is from Rebecca Gonzalez, which is, are delegate votes public?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then a follow-up question from Gerald Rogan in terms of, please talk about Nebraska and the other states that have a policy other than winner takes all electors.
Yeah, so Nebraska and Maine select their electors, or some of their electors, by congressional district. So there's nothing in the Constitution that says a state has to use winner-take-all rules, which is what most states do, except for Nebraska and Maine. Instead, in Nebraska and Maine, I can't remember the precise number of districts in those states, but they have electors that are selected by congressional district. So whichever candidate wins the vote in that congressional district, they get an elector. And then there are two statewide electors in each of those states. So there was a brief attempt in Nebraska. The Republicans wanted to switch Nebraska to a winner-take-all state, the national parties, because they're likely to win the state in a winner-take-all election. But there's one district in Nebraska, I assume it's the one that contains Lincoln, Nebraska, the University of Nebraska, typically votes Democratic. And so in an election that's going to be super close, switching that over to winner-take-all might benefit the Republicans, but that didn't go anywhere in the legislature, as far as I know. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. And so another question from the audience. I know I've selected someone on that side, so from this side first, if folks want to ask a question. All right, and if you could just say your name and then affiliation, that'd be great.
Hi, my name is Ariane, and I'm a student at UCLA. I just wanted to ask, other than all of the maybe like attempted assassinations and all of the other extreme situations, in terms of health concerns, do you think that there should be age limits for presidential candidates? And if so, would that infringe on maybe the First Amendment or any other kind of constitutional provisions?
Yeah, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, so age caps, I mean, that's a interesting question. I mean, there's laws about age discrimination. So as I get older, I think about these as I flip into different categories. Yeah, I'm personally kind of hesitant to do that, and that the age cap should be something that's decided by voters, whether or not candidates has the capacity to go forward. And so I think that's a decision that should ultimately be left up to voters. And on the legal side, I suppose you could have a constitutional amendment which puts an age cap on. That would be the way to do that. I don't know where you would draw that. We do have an age floor, right? You have to be 35 to be president, but no age cap. So I guess my quick answer without thinking about it deeply is that it should be up to the voters to decide that. And then I didn't talk about this, but once a person becomes president, there is the 25th Amendment, and there is a clause in the 25th Amendment which provides a process if a president becomes incapacitated for some reason. There is a process to elevate the vice president or potentially others in the presidential line of succession. So there is a procedure in there, at least when someone's become president. The tricky thing is, what if someone doesn't feel like they're? And these are the hard issues that we've been wrestling with, the Democrats have been wrestling with for the past couple of weeks. And yeah.
All right, well, so this next question over on Zoom, which is going to be our last question today, might actually dovetail off of that statement, which is, can a doctor determine if a candidate is not well enough to be a candidate?
I'm not a medical doctor. We have one in the back of the room. I don't know. It would, yeah. I mean, ideally we would be getting some sort of medical reports on these candidates. I mean, they don't have to, right? There's no legal obligation to do so. That might be useful information for voters to know. But what does it mean to have capacity? I don't know what the threshold there is. And the other thing to remember, I don't know if this will offer any comfort for any of these candidates, but the presidency is not a single individual. It's an administration. It's a team of individuals. And so we've had presidents who have, as I said, have been very ill while president. Woodrow Wilson was very ill. Ronald Reagan was very ill early in his term. May have been suffering some cognitive decline towards the end of his term. And the country survived. So
Great.
I'll leave it at that.
Great. Always good to leave on a positive note. So thank you so much, Dr. Engstrom, for this fantastic talk today. And our talk has been recorded, so will be available online as well as the PowerPoint presentation. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And also, thank you to just ripping the Band-Aid off and asking some of the most direct and poignant questions of our time. So thank you. You did cover some constitutional law. Thank you to our team here for organizing this today. I want to put 2 events on your calendar. In 2 weeks, we'll have the next speaker series, and that's going to be on July 24th at noon. And that will feature a great topic called Losers Consent, holding a fair and legitimate 2024 election, featuring a very distinguished professor, Dr. Richard Hassan from UCLA. He's on the faculty at both the political science as well as the law school, and is the leader of the, I think it's Saving Democracy Center. And I think you're going to love it because you will see him on television, on CNN. You'll see him in columnists everywhere. And what better time to have an election law expert talk with us about legitimate elections? The real focus will be shoring up our election system. What are some ideas for doing that in the coming election? And then on August 13th, there will also be a continuation of what's called the California Leadership Series. And we will have an end of session sesh just here with some key leaders who are participants in policy making in the Capitol and the Capitol community, talking about what does the end of session look like. For those of you in Sacramento area, you know that that's all about what happens before the legislature ends its session for this 2-year session. So be sure to put those on your calendar. That's August 13th as well as July 24th. And thank you for coming.